When you're on the ground looking at this, the first thing that strikes you is the precision of the lines. They're absolutely smooth, absolutely even. And where are the footprints or tire tracks? There is no sign how anyone could have come here and done this work and then left. Just to have the land surveyed and laid out with this accuracy would cost $100,000. But why would anyone create something this big, this precise, this far from where anyone would see it?
It sounds like something from a movie.
It was first spotted by National Guard reconnaissance pilots.
A grand geometric design in the Oregon Desert has some talking UFOs.
From the air, the mysterious symbol seems to bloom, almost come to life.
The other part is, when you see it from the sky, it's symmetrically perfect. On the ground, you not only get an up-close look at the drawing, but you start to realize what may have gone into actually making it. An incredible job of surveying, and it's in the middle of absolute nowhere.
But the questions remain. Who did it and why?
In the fall of 2014, I was writing stories, some of my escapades over the years, and I was up in Milwaukee. My daughter was helping me write some of the stories, and we started writing about my desert adventure, I call it. And I couldn't remember how to spell Yantra. So I said, Jamie, Google it and let's get the right spelling. She Googled it and then she said, Dad, you better come here. And there's literally, the screen was full of websites and blogs and YouTube videos about the Yantra in the desert. And we sat down and we started reading through them, and it was like, it was amazing to me. I had not thought about it in 20 years.
History has shown that events reported may not always be what they seem, and that we may sometimes be blinded by unverified or false information. The carved Sri Yantra design found in the Oregon Desert in 1990 is one such story, a puzzling and intriguing story, clouded in myths and conspiracy for over 2.5 decades. The 190th Air National Guard Reconnaissance Squadron, flying out of Mountain Home Air Base, Boise, Idaho, in late August 1990, photographed a very large and unusual object during a routine photo reconnaissance training flight over the Oregon Desert. It was only later, while the training photos were being examined, that the unexpected discovery was made.
The Idaho Air National Guard has a huge mystery on its hands, and that's our top story today. During routine photo reconnaissance missions over Oregon, RF-4 jets spotted and took photographs of a huge carving in the desert over 1,000 feet across.
The mysterious design has appeared carved in the dirt of a dry and isolated Oregon lake bed. From the ground, all you can see are furrows going every which way, tiny trenches precisely 4 inches deep. But from the air, a stunning sight revealed. Fully 1/4 mile across, it's a complex design of nested triangles and swirls in exactly parallel lines. Its symmetry is perfect.
It's relatively recent, like mid-August.
Surveyors say that creating the strange design would have required enormous effort, high-tech transit equipment, and perhaps $100,000 worth of time and gear. And there is something else puzzling here, something you do not see. You do not see tire tracks, the kind of tracks that might be made by a tractor or a plow. No tire tracks and no footprints. Whoever carved the Oregon Desert design, whatever carved it, surely wasn't hunting for publicity. It's tucked between twin mountain ranges in one of the more remote corners of the continental U.S.
The design was found in an area of the Oregon high desert called Mickey Basin, which is located east of Steens Mountain in the southeastern part of the state of Oregon. Because no water ever flows out of Mickey Basin, it is dominated by a dry lake bed or playa. Further, because it's separated from the Pacific Ocean by 2 mountain ranges, the Cascades and Steen Mountain Escarpment, it receives about 1/3 of the 15 inches of annual rainfall that is common outside of the Steens Mountain rain shadow. Because of its extreme dryness and summer temperatures of 100 degrees Fahrenheit plus, the playa is completely free of vegetation, and its dry silt surface can remain free of water for many years at a time. Mountain Home Air Base, Boise, Idaho. 30 days after the reconnaissance photos were taken, the Guard released their findings, stating that the design was not part of a government program and it was not made by extraterrestrials. The U.S. Bureau of Land Management in Burns, Oregon, stated that where the design was located is a protected wilderness study area and that no motor-driven vehicles are permitted there. Bureau of Land Management officials have launched their own investigation to find those that defaced the desert dry lake bed soil.
Sergeant Charlie Swindell of the 124th Tactical Recon Group developed the first film canisters.
When I saw the negative, I thought maybe one of my people was kind of pulling a joke on us. When we first started in on the 5th, we saw some film that had been shot on the 4th of September. And it was just straight lines out in the desert. Didn't mean a whole lot. But it did kind of make us curious as to how long it had been there. This is one of our regular routes. So we backtracked film and saw some film on the 24th of August. It had a really good negative. It had the whole image on it right straight down so you could see just how good it really is. I got to take a little airplane ride in a private aircraft, to fly out there and actually see it myself. And it was definitely awe-inspiring. Being an ex-cop, I was more or less treating it like a crime scene. That means I physically inspected the site. I looked for anything, footprints, tracks. I measured everything. The precision really impressed me.
It's 1/4 of a mile in diameter, apparently furrowed by hand.
Drawn a lot more attention than I thought it would. Probably a whole lot more attention than the perpetrator thought it would. But it's beautiful. It really is. It's extremely symmetrical. Everything is really straight. The circles are almost perfect.
If I remember correctly, one of the RF-4Cs found it and took a picture of it in the photo lab. And then one of the guys that worked in the maintenance control office, said, "Hey, Jerry, there's a couple of news reporters want to go there. Would you fly them out there?" And I says, "You buy the gas." I thought it was pretty impressive. And with the compass of my airplane and flying over and looking at the alkali flat to land, I noticed that, the major lines in the design were on cardinal headings, and they were exactly right. And there was just a lot of buzz and talk about it. Who did it? Where did it come from?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This has been a night for mysteries.
A bizarre puzzle similar to this one has turned up here in the Northwest.
So far, no one has claimed credit for making the design, and none of the local ranchers admit to knowing anything about it.
Surveyors say to do a job like this would cost tens of thousands of dollars and take hundreds of man-hours.
It's like one of these camping shovels that bend at a 90-degree from the handle, and you can get down and kind of hoe and scrape the dirt to each side.
It was a thing of beauty, and to leave it, I felt it more leaving than at any other point because I just wanted to go back to it. I felt very drawn back to it.
Lots of questions have surfaced as to who's behind this pictograph, including the possibility that it's a Star Wars laser experiment, if you can believe that one.
The 124th continues to fly missions over the area once a week, but no investigation is underway. Coordinates of the area is being kept quiet to preserve the carving, a carving both beautiful and mysterious.
What really happened that late summer in the Oregon desert? Because it took so long for the Guard to release their findings, some people wondered if the government was keeping something from them. There were questions about its creation. If it was made by man, how was its design so perfectly executed without heavy equipment? And why were there no footprints or tracks left behind? Newspapers throughout the world carried the story for weeks, while broadcast stations made it a day and night news event.
A professor from Boise State University, Felix Heap, says he recognized the symbol immediately. Dr. Heap, who studied Indian and Hindu art, says the symbol is called a yantra. The design is a fixture in the Hindu religion and used as an aid in meditation. It represents the paradox between time and eternity.
In India, the Sri Yantra is found in people's homes, on their altars, and even as the underlying plan by which temples have been made. Tradition has it that several ancient Indian cities were laid out according to the design of the Sri Yantra, and became known for their auspiciousness because of the powerful resonance of natural laws that resulted. According to traditional sources, the Sri Yantra has been a part of life in India for thousands of years. Being a yantra, this mathematically irrational design is considered to be much more than a mere symbol, which can only represent an idea or concept. Because of this status, it's no surprise that there's a body of traditional rules governing how it is made, where it is placed, how it is treated, and what is to be expected as an outcome of correct or incorrect use of it. Today it remains a strong tradition that proper construction of a Sri Yantra, whether made by lines drawn on paper, etched in metal, or built from stone, will generate an influence of peace, harmony, well-being, and spiritual growth for the maker and the environment. An artist from Iowa came forward to say he and some friends had made it.
The man who created the design is surprised, yet pleased it drew so much attention.
We put it where you've seen where it is. We didn't expect anybody would see it. Even though they did see it, we didn't think anybody would get excited about it. And it's wonderful. You know, that to me is very satisfying.
Witherspoon had help from 4 other people, including his own 10-year-old son. He said it took 10 days to create the symbol using simple geometry. Witherspoon could be facing a fine by the BLM for defacing public land. It's a fine he's ready to pay.
What was done and why it was done had its own story, its own complexity, which maybe is as rich as the alien possibility. A friend had asked me if I knew about the Sri Yantra, and I said, well, sort of, you know. And I thought, but would you make me one? And I said, well, I don't know if I can make you one. I'll do some research. So again, I did a bunch of research, and some great things came out of that. And I concluded, yes, I could make one. I'm out in the desert making paintings and so forth, making watercolors of the earth shadow and of skies overhead. Now, ever since I started painting, I also pursued geometry. Geometry had something special to it. It was more than just pure mathematics. That there was something which now is called sacred geometry, related to nature in a very important and deep way. And the geometry I chose to put in behind these paintings was the Sri Yantra. So my thought was, okay, if I make with good intention and very carefully and very properly, make one of these Sri Yantras, and I have it behind a painting, will it have an influence? And if I have another painting that's the same, but no Sri Yantra, would there be a way to detect the difference? I made a bunch of work, a bunch of paintings and things, and then I had a show. Maybe it was, I don't know, maybe it was in December. And the title of the show was Paintings You May Not Need to See. And I invited a group of blind people to come to this gallery. We shut the gallery, and there were just those folks. And then we had a question, and I asked them to just experience what they experienced. And they were free to do whatever they wanted. and they moved around and this and that. And these folks went right to that painting that had the Sri Yantra behind it, not any of the others. They could feel the frames, they could feel this, but they went to that one, and they identified that as having some special feeling. I can remember, it was like a flash. Make a Sri Yantra that's big enough that you can live in the Bindu and see what happens. And I'm a diehard meditator, and I want to know what will happen, to my experience, my inner experience, which is what's most important to me, in a way. And I know the place to do it. And I thought, okay, first thing I remember doing this and doing some calculations. How much space do you want? How big do you want this Bindu to be? You'd like to live there, maybe, 3-4 weeks, something like that. As it turned out, it was about 3 weeks, I think. How about 9 feet? That's a nice number. 9-foot diameter. Okay, so I had been working with the oldest Sri Yantra image that I could find, which came from the 16th or 17th century.
26 years after the Sri Yantra was found, artist Bill Witherspoon, along with other members of the design crew who always claimed they had made the desert design, now have come together to clear up the misinformation that has accumulated over the years and to tell their story. Witherspoon began preparing for his vision of creating the Sri Yantra in the desert in the spring of 1990. After deciding on size, location, and proper methods for making the design, he asked 4 of his friends to join him and his son Miles in creating it.
I talked to my son, Miles, who was, I think, about 10 at the time, and asked if he wanted to go, and that was a no-brainer, because he had been out to the desert before and out in that country, and he, of course, loved it.
I remember, I don't exactly remember the time when my dad told me about the Sri Yantra project, but I remember it was not a surprise. He had been taking these trips out to the desert and spending a lot of time working on art there. And I think it was the summer before the Sri Yantra project. He came back after a 2, maybe even 3-month stint in the desert, really excited about a design he'd built around his bus that he was living in at the time. And he was telling me about the positive effect that it had on him and in the environment. And so when, I think it was probably the next spring, when he told me he wanted to get out there and do something like this, it wasn't a surprise. I'd already been primed to think, know that my dad thinks big and really love the desert area.
The first person I thought of was Jim Ansley, because we had met and we had been doing various little projects together, and I liked his video work, and I thought it would be very interesting to have video of this.
When he called me and said, "Jim, will you go to the desert with us?" I was like, "Well, I don't know. I've never been to the desert. I mean, I don't, it's a little scary." But I trusted Bill. Bill said, "I'll take care of you, and I've been there and I know what to do." So I signed on, and it was about 4 months later that we actually went. I had a very good broadcast system and took it with me out there.
And I then thought of Bob Horline and Tony and one other person who has chosen to remain anonymous, unknown, in the spirit of our original agreement. The act of making it sounded very attractive, and of course it was. It was great fun to do it. I mean, it was like a wonderful project to do. It was big, and it was extreme, and it was precise, and it was all these, and it really required a lot of care and creativity to get it the right way. I'm so glad it had these standards that it had to be exact, it had to be precise. We picked the full moon in July as the start, and we estimated it would take us, that we could do it 10 or 12 days. We had made that estimate after we had spent some time talking about it. And different people brought different skills. For example, I gave Tony the procedure for making a SRI Yantra. And he turned that into blueprints. And those blueprints were very helpful. Bob, as a very well-established artist, and he works in large scale.
Bill came one day, called me up on the phone, I suppose, and said that he wanted to do this big line drawing in a dry lake bed in Oregon, in the desert. And my first comment was, there's a desert in Oregon? Because I didn't know that, but I got to know it well. And there is the whole southeastern corner of Oregon is totally unlike the Oregon that we all know about. And so anyway, I said right on the spot, I'm in it. Before I even knew what it was, I said, fine, I'm there, let's do it. When I was in art school, we studied this whole category of art called earthworks. We studied that in school, and it was always something, and it mostly happened in the Western landscape, which growing up out there, of course, I related to. I always wanted to do something like what Michael Heiser, Robert Smithson, Walter D. Maria, these were the guys that were like big when I was in art school.
And similarly, the other person was right ready for it. So we agreed. The ground rules were it was to be anonymous. We weren't doing this for our career. We were doing this for our own individual experience. We weren't going to try and market anything or, nothing like that. And no problem with all that.
The footage that I shot, I ultimately put it away after a period of time, and literally it got lost. I did find the camera masters in a box that was buried in camera masters that I had. So I called Bill Weatherspoon. He was very interested in what I was wanting to do, and he actually said he was happy that maybe the truth could finally be told. But he pretty much stressed to me that he only wanted me to do it if we could tell the real truth, the real facts.
In late July of 1990, Bill and Miles traveled in a school bus studio, towing a pickup from Iowa into the desert to an area called Mickey Basin, where they met the rest of the design crew.
After months of planning and 4 days of driving to get here, it seemed like I went over every possible thing that could happen, right or wrong. Did I have the right tools? Did I have the right amount of rice and dal to feed everyone? As we drove through the gap in the mountains at the south end, and the ply of Mickey Basin began to come into view, its remoteness, its desolation, and its purity hit like a wave. And I remembered why it was here that we were doing this project. Since the 60s, I'd come here to Mickey, most always alone. I'd never see anyone, and once I'd get into the basin, it would be as if I were in a bubble, separate and protected from everything happening in the outside world. What better place could there be to dive into the divine world from which the SRI Yantra emerges?
Now, I really didn't know what the art project was really going to be, and I also didn't know anything about his friends, only that they were Bill's friends. And the fellows came later, the friends, and they were all great guys, and we really got along well. And those fellows that came, I didn't realize they were all artists in their own right.
Bob Orline's work already had appeared in corporate and private collections worldwide. Tony Lauer was an award-winning architect. He drew the set of architectural plans that would be used to construct the design. The fifth talented member of our crew, who wished to be a silent witness, was and continues to be a lover of our Earth and an environmental advocate.
The first afternoon, they all walked out into the dry lake bed to begin laying out their plans and preparations for the next 11 days of work. Work began that night, the first full moon of July. How and why they did it is an inspirational tale of perseverance and artistic excellence, and for Witherspoon, a spiritual exploration.
It took weeks to produce the drawings for the SRI Yantra. Like the blueprints of a house, we knew the drawings would be essential to its construction. Before beginning the work, the team reviewed the plans. Understanding the sequence of work would ensure it would be completed successfully.
Wherever they meet, that's our, and that makes it 90 degrees. Got it. And we just do that at the four corners.
We can double check them by measuring it, right?
But no, Bill's question is appropriate. How do you actually find that point?
Well, a guy stands out. A guy, there's somebody with a wire of X length.
Yeah.
And he can move around, but this point is fixed.
Yes.
This point is fixed, and there's another guy here with this length, and he can move around.
All right. Okay. So then here's the grid.
Wow.
Bob.
Okay. So then we've got our square marked out.
Yeah. That's a simple way.
Yeah.
That's 90 degrees. You know, makes sense.
Yeah.
Parallel line.
And so then we do our circle, our big circle, and then we divide it up, and we.
Do we have enough wire to lay out? We do, to lay out.
We have string to lay this out with.
The string is laying out these lines.
The grid. We lay the
grid
out
but
with
for the circle.
The longest wire we're going to need is the square root, 2 times the square root of 1/8 of a mile.
Or just the square root of 1/8. Yeah, the square root. 1/8 times the square root of 2.
Diagonal.
1/8 times
to
the square
get the
root.
hypotenuse.
So that's right. That's our longest
Right.
piece of wire.
Right.
Okay, that we've got on a heavy gauge.
Each day that we would actually go out there and work on it, we did it at 2 different times. We would go out early in the morning and work for a few hours. And then the temperature would get so hot that we would go back and, in so many words, we would hide from the sun. We'd either get under the bus or in our tents or whatever until about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and then we would go back out and work until the evening because it was much cooler. I'd say the temperatures ranged from 95 to 100 degrees every day.
There were 3 stages for setting up the SRI Yantra on the ground. The first was orientation, second was layout, and the third was plowing. Orientation was done with an ancient technique from an Upanishad, a Vedic text. The text gives instructions on how to erect sacred buildings. The idea is to orient them to the cosmos, and that's to be done by creating an east-west line using solar geometry. First, we put a post in the ground, then we inscribed a circle around the post, and then we watched the shadow of the pole on the ground as the sun rose in the morning and set in the afternoon. We marked the points where the pole's shadow just touched the circle. That became points A and B. And when those points are connected, a perfect east-west line is established. Next, we extended the line to be about 1,500 feet, or 750 feet in each direction. That's a little more than a quarter of a mile total.
No, I mean, which direction?
The line became the east-west reference line for building the entire SRI Yantra. Using geometry, creating a perpendicular at the middle of this line, we made a north-south line, and that became the second reference line. So then we had a perfect grid, east, west, north, and south. In fact, the entire SRI Yantra has only one axis of symmetry. It is east-west with the 4 triangles pointing east, and the 5 pointing west. Or, when presented vertically, 4 triangles point up and 5 point down. At the intersection of the east-west and north-south reference lines, we put in a new post. The old post for tracking the sun shadow had been removed. This new post became the center of the SRI Yantra and the anchor for the wire compasses that scratched the large and small circles on the playa surface. Now, with the center established, we were ready to begin laying out the actual lines of the SRI Yantra. The first thing that we did was to draw the 9-foot circle that represents the center point, or Bindu. Then, by measurement, we marked 9 points at prescribed spots on the east-west axis. Next, we made a circle that goes through the 2 outermost of these 9 points. That circle was exactly 600 feet in diameter.
My favorite memory from the experience was actually the technique and knowing about the technique that we used to create the design. We got there first night, first day, we started the design by kind of digging a hole and putting a pole on the ground. And we used that as the center access point to build this entire design. Now there's some pretty cool ancient surveying techniques where you're finding true solar east-west and then building a north-south axis on that. But I recall some experts coming out there talking about how it would cost $70,000, $75,000 in surveying costs alone. And I knew the secret. I knew, hey, you can probably go out there for a couple grand, a bunch of wire and some poles, and make a massive project like this. And to me, that was a little secret that I was always really proud of. I didn't quite know what I was getting myself into in terms of the work and what would be expected of us on this project, but I was definitely pretty fired up about the whole trip.
Then, using geometric procedures and these 9 points, we built the 9 triangles in their prescribed order, according to the centuries-old procedure we'd learned from the Badranath tradition of India. As the lines of the 9 triangles intersect with each other, they generate needed points to guide the lines of the subsequent triangles until all 9 are done. So it's all in a way very complicated, and yet if you follow it correctly, it can be done simply. Next, we made another circle of 800-foot diameter. This circle was 200 feet larger than the circle that enclosed the 9 triangles. And then still further out from the center, we made 4 circles all at once. This created 2 rings that were spaces for the 8 and 16 petals, as well as the 4 circular girdles that are outside the petals. Beyond the girdles, again using geometric procedures, bisecting angles, making perpendiculars and extending lines, we made the 4 closed gates that surround the entire design. When the layout was completed, the entire 13 miles were plowed. First, we plowed the 9 triangles in the exact order they were laid out. Then we plowed outward from the ring of 8 to 16 petals, and from there we plowed the girdle lines and then finally the gates. The plowing was always done in a clockwise direction. The inner 9-foot circle, or Bindu, at the center was the very last thing to be plowed. And when we did that, we were done. We celebrated by sitting down in the center and meditating for a few minutes.
Sometimes while using the aluminum cable as a compass and marking the circles, the wire would break. We'd have to stop and repair it. It seemed like the tools were always on the other side of the design where the rest of the crew was working. We'd yell to get their attention, or we'd have to make the trip to where they were to get the tools. We had decided from the start not to use walkie-talkies, and this made communicating over a quarter mile really difficult, so we ended up doing a lot of walking.
Every day it seemed to get hotter and hotter. When the time came to mark the 4 outer circles, the temperature was probably around 100 degrees. Dry heat, no shade. It took hours to mark the circles, measuring about a mile in length from beginning to end. I stood between the center pole and the crew, and it was my job to hold a compass wire off the ground so it wouldn't drag and catch on the playa. The adults made 4 circles by scratching the surface with marking poles which were attached together and fastened to a compass wire which ran from the center pole close to 1/8 of a mile out. My dad, who's positioned on the outside pole, looked along the wire towards the center pole and kept calling at me to speed up or slow down so we could all move together in a straight line and the circles would be perfect.
Tony.
This was the toughest thing we did by far.
Good.
We all stopped a bunch of times to rest and drink water. It was hard work.
I was definitely an errand boy. I remember getting more flags. We had these little nails with sort of yellow tape that we'd use to mark points and spots, and really trying to be as helpful as I could.
Steady. Okay. That is perfection. That is perfection. Wow. Amazing. Yeah, that good work. Great. Hey, rock. Great. You did it perfect. Can't even know it everywhere. We go for all Woo! Good job, Miles. Look at it. Great. You did it perfect. Can't even tell where the. Can't even tell where the
You know, we wanted to make this line drawing in this dry lake bed. We didn't want to, in any way permanently destroy or deface the land. We wanted it to be there and then to go away. And the water in the winter, the wave action and whatnot ended up eliminating what we did there. And so we didn't want to remove soil from there and make trenches. This is not a nice thing to do on public land, and we didn't want to do a destructive thing. So we wanted it to be limitedly invasive, but still be quite visible. So I remember our standard out there was to make it as perfect as we could. And from the air, you get enough distance on it, it looked dynamite perfect. But on the ground, I've seen pictures of these people out there saying how humans couldn't have done this. It was so perfect. And so that was part of the mystery. The other part was, and this came later and was even more astonishing, the idea that when we claimed that we did it, we were somehow in cahoots with the government covering up some, I don't know what, some plot to do what. It never made much sense to me. That was it. We never thought anybody would ever see it. From the ground, you didn't really know what it was. You could see it was something, but you couldn't really see what it was. And I never saw it, of course, in the big view until I saw Bill went up in an airplane and shot still photos. And I never saw it from the air either. And when we saw it from the air, it was like, wow. Then you could really see it.
To achieve a perfect result, we were constantly checking our work to make sure that the preliminary marking lines we'd scratched were correct. A scratched marking line, if made incorrectly, could be changed, but a deep furrow made with the plow could not be easily changed. Tony's step-by-step construction drawings were a big help in this regard. Once all the marking lines were completed, it was time to plow the furrows. For this process, we'd purchased an old-fashioned garden cultivator at a junk store in Iowa. We'd removed its blade and replaced it with a single tooth from a tractor-pulled agricultural cultivator. While more difficult to pull, this blade made a deeper and wider furrow and threw the dirt off to both sides in a uniform fashion. It actually worked surprisingly well. We tried to do our work in the morning before the sun got high in the sky and the temperature got up into the high 90s. We'd stop around noon, eat and rest, even sleep in the shade of the bus, and then we'd start again in the late afternoon when it was cooler. And then we'd work till well after sunset. This pattern gave us 10-hour days to get the work done. Red flags and red ribbons tied around 10-penny nails had been placed along the scratched lines, or in some cases, like the long lines of the outer gate, ribboned nails on the ground were placed every 8 to 10 feet, and those were the only markers for the plowing team. When the pedals were plowed, it took 4 people to ensure that the furrow lines were done perfectly. 2, the mule team, pulled the plow, while 1 steered the plow from behind and 1 guided the plow from the side. This was necessary because the person steering the plow had to concentrate on keeping the plow blade in the ground. And he couldn't always see the lines due to the tight curves and the mule team who blocked the view of the line ahead. Plowing was undoubtedly the hardest work, and it took several days to complete. 13 miles is a lot of lines. Everyone took turns pulling, and we converted backpacks into harnesses to spread the strain more uniformly on our bodies. We carried gallons of water in the backpacks, and we each drank several gallons of water a day during our brief rests. It sounds grueling, but no one experienced it that way. We were all filled with a kind of joy that came from being fully immersed in the beauty of nature and making something of deep meaning.
Good job, guys. It looks really good. Yeah, it does.
It looks pretty the way it picks up this curve. Actually, is that curve. Yeah.
We decided we weren't going to drink any soft drinks, certainly not any alcohol, and we drank water, and we learned quickly that warm water was better than trying to keep it cold, which really we had no way to do anyway. So we drank warm water. I remember by the time it's been out in the sun all day, it's hot water. And it was great, you know, it just washes everything out, and we drank gallons of it. And there was a big well over at the side of the basin there where we went over and filled up all our water bottles every now and then.
The SRI Yantra was 95% completed. Jim Ansley had to catch his plane back to St. Louis from Boise the next afternoon, so Bill suggested they get to the top of the mountain to the west to record video footage of the design from there. This would be the first time that any of them would see the SRI Yantra from a high location. Bill, Miles, and Jim left about 2 p.m., thinking it would take a few hours to reach the top.
And we were supposed to get up there, say, 3, 4 in the afternoon. But the road ended up being a lot rockier and bumpier than we thought it would. And we didn't get up there until the sun was just about to set.
With no roads and having to backtrack several times, they finally reached the top of the mountain at 5:30, an hour and a half later than they had intended.
So it wasn't really a road. But we did get up there, and then it was getting dark. It got dark. We had a car battery, because all the camera batteries were dead by this time. I think we had a pole or something. We carried it between us, hauled it off to the edge. And then when we got to the edge, the exciting thing was we could see it. And that was the first time we got any sense of the scale of the thing.
By the time we got to the top, it was almost getting dark. And we were under pressure to get to a spot, find out if that was where we wanted to be, and then get our gear over to the side of the mountain to look down on the Yantra.
Darkness had already started to fall as the sun dropped below the high mountains to the west, throwing a dark shadow on the design. Jim couldn't get his camera positioned fast enough and was having trouble just seeing the design lying thousands of feet below.
And get the tripod set up. I mean, the light was literally just going. But our eyes could see it down below, and it was magnificent. I mean, Bill was so excited because it was the first time he was able to see it from high.
They both could see the other crew members still working. The SRI Yantra was so large that the crew looked like ants as they walked across its surface.
I'm trying to get the camera set up and look through, and I couldn't see it. I mean, I could see it and I couldn't see it. You know, I'm shooting to a black and white monitor, and the light's almost gone, and I've got the camera cranked up as high on the gain as I wanted because I didn't want it to just be terrible footage. But I finally was able to make a couple moves across it. And Bill kept saying, "Can you see it? Can you see it?" And I kept saying, "Yeah, I can see it, but not very well." I didn't want to tell him how bad I couldn't see it, you know. So I would do these pans, and I'd lose it in the pan. I'd be not even looking at it anymore. But I must have did about 10 or 15 pans, you know, like quickly back and then slowly moving across.
On the 10th day, the SRI Yantra was finally complete. The crew gathered in the center circle, the Bindu of the SRI Yantra, and meditated to celebrate their accomplishment. As the crew approached their camp, which was about 3/4 of a mile from the center of the design, they were met with an unusual cooling breeze. Looking to the southwestern skies, they watched as a rare thunderstorm moved into the basin directly over them and the SRI Yantra. What happened next would change everything, but as Bill would say later, it was nature's way of completing their work.
A storm moved in just over Mickey Basin. Now, that's the weird part. It does happen you get thunderstorms out in the desert like this. You do. I mean, I've spent time out there. This happens. But this dumped, I would say, between 3/10 and 5/10 of an inch of rain in maybe 20 to 30 minutes at the most, and just in Mickey Basin.
It's just like nature opened up and poured, cleaned everything out of the desert. And after spending 2-3 weeks working hard, dusty, dirty on the earth, it was a really special experience to be in that rain. The thing I didn't realize or didn't understand about the rain was it was going to wash away all traces of us. And that's really what it did. The rain came down, all the footprints, everything, all the signs that we'd been there and worked for the past couple of weeks on this project were cleared away by the rain.
It completely melted, dissolved the surface. And then by evening, it was dried off. When that happens, when that much water comes on the playa, It melts everything, cracks, everything disappears, it becomes smooth, and then it dries out. Then it gets shiny. It gets highly reflective, and it was that way, highly reflective, and there was not a footprint, there was not a crack, there was not anything. It was like this painting got glazed. So when it got washed by the rain, quite honestly, for all of us who were there, that was nature telling us, you're finished and I'm taking care of it from now on. But we weren't the only ones who saw it or who were tickled. I stopped at my rancher friend at Man Lake Ranch, and I stopped and said hi to he and his wife. And he said, Witherspoon, I don't know exactly what it is you're doing out there, but I want you to do it on my land. I want that rain. And I asked him if there was a chance that he could take me up and I could see it and photograph. I had a couple of rolls of slide film and an old, SLR. So I think it was the next day I came in to the ranch and they flew me up. And we went up to as high as 12,000 feet and then down and got a few good slides, got a few good images. And then I went back in and that's when I just sort of hunkered down in the Bindu for the next 3 weeks or so. Living and meditating in the Bindu was a high point in my life. I can't really describe it. I could say it was profoundly peaceful or deeply spacious and silent, and yet it was really indescribable. Meditating in the different triangles around the Bindu gave different subtle qualities or flavors to the meditation. But in the Bindu itself, somehow, nothing was present, and at the same time, everything was present. And it's hard to honestly say more than that the time was spent there. Maybe this is something of what is meant by transcendence. Whatever, the experiment was successful, and that time in the Bindu became a kind of spiritual benchmark that remains with me to this day. After spending time in the Bindu, I decided it was time to go home because I really wanted to get back to my studio to make some new work. I was charged with a lot of ideas and a lot of things that I wanted to make.
I went to California, picked up the family. We were on a kind of extended vacation. It might have been a week or two before we got back to Fairfield. And meanwhile, everybody else straggled in at whatever pace they did. And we all said, hey, it was really fun being out there, and that was the end of it.
And I got a phone call from somebody out in Oregon. Hey, Witherspoon, is that you? Did you do that? I said, what? And I said, do what? And they then told me that there was something all over the newspaper and Oregonian, and there was all this flap and TV and all this stuff. I didn't know anything about it. And I said, oh, yeah.
I got a call from Bill, and he said, have you seen the news? And I said, no. And he said, well, the Yantra's been discovered, and it's all over the news.
And Tony Lawler was sitting in he was making, I think he was in his kitchen, but he had CNN on the tube, and all of a sudden he hears, and in the middle of the Oregon desert is this strange diagram, and he goes, what? And he goes out and looks at it, and there was a picture of our SRI Yantra, and all of a sudden, starting that day or so, it became this big news story.
And then I started getting calls from some reporters and from a professor out of Oregon.
James Deardroff, a retired professor of meteorology from Oregon State University, was convinced it was a government cover-up of an extraterrestrial event. The professor wrote a 16-page article that was published in the California UFO magazine, explaining in great detail why he was sure that Witherspoon and his friends could not have made the design.
He talked to me on the phone and ended the conversation by saying, well, I don't believe you, and this was a government cover-up.
Because it was so big and it was so precise, and it then suggested something that was non-human, alien. And so people didn't want to let go.
And so I talked to Bill, and I told him I don't want to talk to anybody anymore. And apparently the other fellows did do some interviews, but they were reluctant to get involved. We just didn't, we really, all of us that were out there, Bill and all the other fellows, we really couldn't understand what the big hoopla was.
Then there were a whole bunch of newspaper articles starting in the Oregonian in Portland and then going all over the country and even all over the world. Little did we know that this would suddenly become a raging controversy. And I mean, we were as flabbergasted as anything. And I remember there was the one side of it said that only aliens could have made this, like human beings couldn't have made this. And I remember saying to Bill at some point, I said, let's be aliens. Let's like play this for all it's worth. Let's milk this for and have a really good time with this. Bill was more serious and didn't want to do that. And so, okay, so we won't do that.
I think one of the biggest challenges to truth and people accepting truth and recognizing truth is so-called confirmation bias. That is that once I believe something, the only evidence that I'm really going to put a lot of stock in is evidence that supports what I already believe. And so I'm either going to ignore any evidence that suggests my original belief is incorrect, or I'm going to look for holes in that argument. I'm going to look for ways to refute that truth because that new information threatens what I already believe.
With almost no evidence at all, they were all the way to aliens and not believing us when it wasn't actually that difficult to do it the way we did it.
Right. I understand where confirmation bias comes from, and I think that we're all guilty of this to a certain extent because the world is a really complicated, messy, sometimes anxiety-producing place. And so I think that we want to sort of feel safe. And so figuring out which box to put something in and keeping things in that box makes the world a bit more safe for us, I think, and makes our lives a little bit easier.
That's always my example, or that's what taught me that if people really want to think some way, any amount of evidence or common sense or none of that enters in. It's
agree.
like
I learned that lesson too.
The story was never really told properly. It was always told through the eyes of the news organizations, reporters that were really sensationalizing the issue. I think to some extent, to build the story, and it was a mystery, it was an exciting mystery, but to build the story, a lot of folks who really didn't know what they were talking about were called in as experts to represent this design.
we were back in Fairfield, Iowa, a group of us doing interviews for this movie, and Bill thought that maybe this plow, the original plow, was still in his garage in the rafters. And so we went out to take a look and had the camera rolling, and sure enough, there it was. We were really surprised at the actual plow, and we all remembered it had the tie-ons where we tied it onto the ropes and cables, and it was another one of those great discoveries.
When I saw that plow again, my first impulse was, my God, that thing is so rickety. How the hell did we do that?
All of a sudden, we all started talking about going back out to the desert and reliving some of those memories, doing some filming and checking out the whole place again.
And so we kind of mulled that over as we took off and headed back into town.
On September 5th of 2017, we did return to Mickey Basin in the Oregon Desert. Even with the smoky haze from distant forest fires that hung over the mountains, the basin looked much like it had 27 years before. As we reached the place we had camped on the edge of the dry lake bed, we discovered that a part of our journey of creating the SRI Yantra was still there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was blown away to see this stuff out in the desert, sitting there like that. I mean, it had been a really, really long time. I didn't even think they'd be there. I figured they'd have dissolved from the weather and the environment. But here they are, and they've got this like kind of cool, weathered look to them, almost furry from all the sun and the environment. But
well, they were up in that high spot in the willows. We put them up in the willows.
Yeah.
That meant that they didn't get washed away, or some of them didn't. Some weren't. Not everything was there. Right. A lot of stuff had washed away.
Yeah.
But there were a few there.
What they were the original sticks that we actually scratched the lines with. And we know they're the real thing because they've got the wires, they've got the grooves that we made in them, groove on top, groove on bottom, and it's got the little screw on the bottom that was actually the marking point. And these were the ones that we used, and this wood's still in pretty fair shape.
It's amazing.
This is a story that I've told people about, but I haven't had the chance to show the pictures to my son. I'm really looking forward to saying, hey, this is me when I was a little guy. This is how I grew up. These are some of the people and some of the experiences that I had the opportunity to participate in. And I think he's going to get a real kick out of it.
Well, it's a thought about completion too, that first of all, we completed our plans and got here. Then we actually did all that work and completed the work of bringing the idea literally down to earth. And now we're in another completion. We're completing a video about this. And who knows what the next completion is. And it makes me think, when your son is 10 years old, you'll bring him here too. And this is how the world keeps going. It's a good thing.
The multidimensional significance of the SRI Yantra, created by artist Bill Witherspoon and his team, may have characterized an evolutionary step in earth art. Not only was the symbol and the art object within its desert context worthy as a social, environmental, and even spiritual contribution, but also the unusual events surrounding its discovery constituted a kind of inadvertent performance art, with the media and the general public as participants. Even though this unsigned work of art has been reclaimed by nature's wind and rain over the years, its artistic value was clear in its creation, and now that it is gone, all that is left is the indelible impression of how special it was. Perhaps this creation touched something deep and worthwhile in the public's collective consciousness. Quite possibly, if the traditional understanding and uses of the SRI Yantra are valid, what remains is a subtle influence of peace and harmony in a remote corner of North America. Could any art object hope to do more?